Hello, and welcome to Davenant Hall Professor Spotlight. I'm Nathan Johnson, the Provost of Davenant Hall, and today we will be interviewing the Reverend Dr. Matt Colvin, who is an instructor in Bible at Davenant Hall. I'd like to welcome the Reverend Dr. Matt Colvin.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So, for those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing now, and maybe even a little bit of how you got to where you are.
Sure. I'm very amused that you Reverend Doctored me. I was riding in a car with my 15-year-old daughter. She was talking about her career aspirations, which might include medical school. I remarked, Hosanna, if you become a doctor, you'll be the third Dr. Colvin in as many generations, because my dad has a PhD too. And she says, yeah, but I would be a real doctor, she said. This is my third year at Davenant, and I teach just one course per year in the summers, and it's always a Bible course. My parents are classicists. My mother had a master's in Latin. My dad has a PhD in Greek. And the apple didn't far fall from the tree. I was surrounded by all these pretty books that full of Latin and Greek. This was my childhood growing up, and I majored in Latin and Greek at the University of Maryland, and then went on to Cornell. More of a Hellenist than a Latinist. I remember my first Greek class in college. I was asked, "Why do you want to take Greek?" And my answer was to read the New Testament and Homer. And now I'm blessed with a job. I teach also for Wilson Hill Academy, which is an online classical Christian high school. And I get to teach Greek and Latin for a living. I pinch myself sometimes that I should be able to earn my living like this. Our family lives on Vancouver Island, off the coast of British Columbia. My wife is a midwife. I wouldn't be able to live where we do if it weren't for online teaching. So I'm very thankful for my day job and for Davenant for letting me teach over Zoom, which I enjoy greatly. I was born with a hearing loss. You can see this hearing aid in my ear here. And that's kind of a hindrance when you're in person teaching in a brick and mortar classroom. But it's not a hindrance for teaching on Zoom. It just means I'm not wearing a big bulky headset or white AirPods sticking out of my ear. All the audio goes straight to my hearing aids, and it works wonderfully. I guess I should probably tell you a little bit about why I ended up. First, why did I end up pursuing graduate studies and focusing on what I did? And then how did that shift so that I'm now teaching Bible, which was not my area of study in either university or grad school. I guess it was sophomore year of college. I was blessed to be in a big survey course of Greek philosophy, covering from the pre-Socratics. I guess it ended with Aristotle. I didn't get into the Hellenistic schools much, but pre-Socratics, Plato, and Aristotle. And it was taught by Professor James Lesher. I think he's at the University of North Carolina now. And it was mostly kids who needed a philosophy course or were philosophy majors. And I was not. I was a classics major. And I had learned Greek the previous year. Unlike my own students, I didn't get Greek until I got to university. And Dr. Lesher knew that I and one other student out of the 50 in the class knew some Greek. So he invited us privately to his office to sit on his couches under his torchlight lamps and translate fragments of the pre-Socratic philosophers. So I felt like I'd entered the inner sanctum, that I had been admitted into the company of the people who really knew what was going on with these texts. And the watershed moment for me was when he asked me to translate a fragment of Heraclitus. And I had worked on it for homework, and I had a proposal for how I thought it worked. And one of the beautiful things about teaching young people Greek is that they don't know what they don't know. And sometimes that's a good thing. So I translated this fragment of Heraclitus totally differently than the received translations. And I just brought Dr. Lesher up short. Wow, that's very interesting, he said. And he ended up giving me a footnote in his next article. And that was kind of the moment that made me feel like, wow, I could do this. I could be a Greek scholar. And then grad school followed a couple of years later. So that's kind of a formative moment for me, because I don't know if you've ever read the pre-Socratic philosophers, but they survive mainly in fragments, little quotations, and other philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Clement of Alexandria or someone. And that means there's not much context, and they're ripped from their context. And there's not a lot of continuous text. Occasionally there'll be something longer, like Parmenides Fragment 8, has some scores of lines. But most of them are short. You're trying to squeeze all the meaning you can out of a 2-line fragment or 4-line fragment. And to do that, that means you're keenly aware of the missing context, and your mind has to kind of try to supply it. So you have to use your imagination. You have to speculate. You have to try certain things. And of course, that makes it sound squishy and imprecise. But the other half of the pair of scissors here, in addition to imaginative interpretation, is you have to be very rigorous about your philology. You have to test your imaginative hypotheses against the fine details of the grammar and vocabulary of the text. And that means you become very aware of any time an interpretation conflicts with even the slightest detail of the text. It's a very good training for how to read really carefully and closely. And what I learned from Dr. Lesher and that course and other courses on mostly on Greek philosophy from the classic side of things rather than the philosophy side of things, what I learned there turned out to be very applicable to biblical exegesis as well. And so I ended up writing my dissertation on interpretations of Heraclitus. And most of us are familiar with Heraclitus from the sort of cocktail party summary. You can't step into the same river twice, which he didn't actually say. What he said was, upon those stepping into the same rivers, different and again different waters flow, which is not exactly the same thing as saying that everything is always changing all the time in every respect. That's rather saying there is something that continues and is preserving its identity through time. That is a river. It's got the same banks. It's flowing in the same directions. It's composed of water. It's not changing in every respect, but rather the constant change in the material water that is constituting the river If it isn't flowing, then you don't have a river, you've just got a ditch. And so it's another example of Heraclitus's paradoxical unity of opposites as a point of that fragment. But of course, that fragment gets grabbed onto by Plato and his Cratylus. And he has a slightly different version of it. And it takes on a life of its own. So when Hegel and Heidegger treat of pre-Socratics, that's what Heraclitus kind of stands for. He's the advocate of change. It's a paradigmatic instance of how often philosophers don't pay attention. They are there to grab the text and do cool things with it. What use can I make of this? What truths are here that I can latch onto or extract and then conjure with? But us troglodytes classicists are stuck protesting. No, it doesn't mean that. You need to pay attention to the text. So that's kind of how the study of the pre-Socratics also shapes kind of my approach to the Bible. Often I'm protesting against philosophical theology and that it sometimes misreads the text. So my fourth year of grad school was my downfall. I did finish my dissertation and published several chapters of it as articles, but I fell out of love with Greek philosophy because I discovered two scholars mainly, but I discovered biblical studies in my fourth year. If I had it to do over, I would probably go do another PhD after that. But I discovered David Darby and N.T. Wright, two scholars that I think have probably done more to shape my approach to the Bible than anyone else. I want to give a hat tip to Mark Horn from Biblical Horizons. Now, I guess that's Theopolis. He's the one who turned me on to N.T. Wright. But David Darby, even though he's not a Christian, I think his scholarship shaped my way of approaching the Bible, because the way Darby comes about his insights is he'll come to a text and he'll read it and he'll notice what's weird here. What locutions, what phrases don't seem to make sense? Or what inconsistency does there seem to be in the text? And then he'll ask, how could it come to be that way? And he'll come up with often a background in the history of law. He reads texts with an eye for legal principles. And the result, it's almost like watching a magician at work. He's testing the chains to show you that they're really strong, or he's chopping watermelons with the scimitar or sword that he's going to cut the assistant in half with. And then he does the trick, and the effect is really startling and theatrical. And so, two of my favorite scholars I discovered while I was working on my dissertation, and I almost didn't finish my dissertation because I was so fascinated with what they were doing. I've been running my mouth. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story to kind of hear the shift toward studying scripture, but still maintaining the love of language and the importance of language. So it sounds like every philosopher and theologian needs a fellow philologist or linguist to keep in mind.
I respect and love my philosophy colleagues. But I do think that, the act of the intellectual endeavor that we're engaged in as Christians has different parts. There's application and exhortation and homiletics, and there's philosophy and philosophical theology, and then there's exegesis. And I think as N.T. Wright says, if there is a marriage between exegesis and philosophical theology, then it is, as Paul says, but in a different sense, a great mystery. It shouldn't be the case, but it often is, that philosophical theologians and biblical scholars have little patience with each other. The philosophical theologians, we can't wait around for the slow grind of the exegetes until they finally produce some useful nugget of interpretation that we can use. And meanwhile, the biblical theologians or biblical scholars are saying, you can't go running away and make your arguments. You need to re-examine the text and see what it says. But I like to think of it like a giant lever. The results near the fulcrum, when an exegete does the hard spade work of philology and explains that the text doesn't really mean that. So, for instance, every Christmas we hear "Peace on earth, goodwill to men," which is taken from the Song of the Angels at Jesus' birth. But I think it's Eirene and Anthropos is eldokias, I think is the Greek. Don't quote me off the top of my head. And does that really mean goodwill to men? Well, the grammar says no. It says peace upon the earth among men of God's good pleasure, is eldokia, which is a term that is often used in legislative contexts. It's an abstract noun formed from a verb that often means it seemed good to. So, for instance, in the Jerusalem decree in Acts 15, it seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit to lay on you no heavier burden than the following four things. Or in decrees by the Athenian Boule, the Athenian council, ruling council of Athens, in classical Athens. The decrees usually start with edoxe te boule. It seemed good to the council to require this. Well, fast forward to the 1950s, and we discover the Dead Sea Scrolls, in which we do, in fact, have a Hebrew equivalent of this phrase, sons of God's good pleasure, which doesn't mean all men indiscriminately. It means basically the elect. It means God's chosen people, the ones that he has decreed are going to be his. So that really shifts a little bit how we hear that message of the angels from Christmas. I could multiply examples, and some of them, unfortunately, are in very beloved texts. For instance, one of my books, I've made an argument that it isn't "Give us this day our daily bread" in the Lord's Prayer. There are lots of good ways to say daily in Greek, and the one that is used in the Lord's Prayer does not mean that. It is never used in Greek literature before the Lord's Prayer. It seems to have been coined to express a peculiarly Jewish idea. St. Jerome comments that in the Gospel to the Hebrews, which is now lost, he encountered, instead of a word meaning daily, he encountered the word mahar, which means for tomorrow. So it's the bread for tomorrow, the eschatological bread, the bread of the final banquet, the bread of the Messiah and his coming, give us today, make it present now. So, yeah, that's kind of what I do. Is I reread the Bible, pay close attention to the words, and I try to bring to bear as much Jewish background as I can, and hope that some hundreds of years later, maybe the church will change some of its liturgical formulas. But that's hard to imagine, isn't it?
Right. So I can imagine a student who is taking other Davenant Hall classes that emphasize historical theology, kind of going back to the sources, reclaiming kind of earlier forms of interpretation, theology. And then they come to your course and you're really trying to help them focus on exegeting the text in front of them, bringing to bear kind of more modern discoveries in history or in the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like that, that maybe people didn't have access to for a lot of church history. I can imagine that there would be kind of a feeling of tension there. How much do I pay attention to kind of earlier theology and exegesis if the work of biblical scholars and philologists are relying on things that earlier theologians didn't have? How do you navigate that?
I lean into it. Yeah. So I think one of the matters that I would stress here is that the Reformation is a movement standing on the shoulders of humanism. And humanism is really the source for, or the beginnings of modern philological method. It's humanists that go through, I think it was Pico della Mirandola, going through the false decretals and saying, this donation of Constantine, whereby the Pope has temporal authority as well as spiritual, because Constantine gifted it to him in exchange or as a thank offering for healing him of leprosy. This is fake. How do we know? Because it talks about Constantine's satraps. There are no such officials in the Roman Empire in the 4th century. And it talks about Constantine getting baptized and cured of leprosy. But we know from Eusebius that Constantine didn't get baptized till near his death, and he never had leprosy. It's just a matter of historical exegesis and knowledge of languages. There are no satraps. Satraps are in the Persian Empire, and then on the Roman Empire. The Erasmus's diglot edition of the New Testament, comparing the Greek and the Latin and calling out mistakes in the Latin and correcting it. Oh my goodness. But theologians are building theology on those mistakes because they're accessing the Bible in the Latin. Well, it's not a coincidence that John Calvin's works were mostly published by the house of Stephanus, Robert Estienne, the French printer. I think he's the son of Henri Estienne. And this printing house has as its colophon, its logo on the first page of every edition, is a picture of an olive tree from Romans 11 with a branch broken off falling to the ground and the inscription, Noli autem sapere, do not be high-minded, but be afraid. It's a dig at the Roman Catholic Church, saying, you think you're the trunk, you're not. You're just branches on this tree. And then Calvin's commentaries. There's also, in the Reformation, a recovery of Christian Hebraism. The Netherlands especially became a haven for Jews that had been kicked out of places like Spain, since the Netherlands was Spanish possession before their independence. Likewise, Reformation England became a haven for refugee Jews. So I would say part of the reclaiming and the recovery and resourcefulness that we should be engaged in is an appreciation for how returning to the text and careful philological attention to it partly generated the Reformation. I don't think we should be ashamed of that. What does that mean for Reformation use of Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or other medieval Latin theologians? Well, there's a lot they get right. We're not going to complain about that. But I do think that when we're dealing with, say, Augustine, not knowing much Greek, not knowing any Hebrew, that there are limits to his ability to exegete the Bible as a result of that. This is a big discussion this past summer in the systematics channel of the Davenant Discord over does philosophical theology sometimes blind its practitioners to doctrines that they should have gotten out of the text, but they didn't get because they were busily employing philosophical ontology to tell them what the text can and cannot say. So that's a disagreement I have with Ryan Hurd and a lot of other guys here. I think it was David Haynes has a book coming out in which he says that when you're doing biblical exegesis, you need to use natural knowledge, by which he really means Aristotelian metaphysics. You need to use natural knowledge to tell you what the text can and cannot say. For me, that is a difficult idea, since Aristotelianism isn't available, isn't even an idea. Aristotelian metaphysics isn't around when the whole Old Testament pretty much is written. That's the majority of the Bible. And I would argue it isn't operative. It isn't popular. It isn't well known. It isn't in the minds of the New Testament authors either. If you ask them, should your text be read by carefully running it through Aristotelianism to determine which things can be said properly of God and which ones are improper predications that are only analogical, I don't think any of the biblical authors ever expected their text to be read that way. So that's a methodological difference between me and Ryan Hurd. I do think that I don't want to be misheard here in being critical of philosophical theology's effects on how we read the Bible. Don't misunderstand me. I have a very high view of the inspiration of the Bible. I think when I'm urging us to pay really close attention to historical background and philology, that's in order to understand the concerns and the field of discourse and the ideas that are driving the habits of thought that are shaping the human authors of the Bible. And when I say shaping the human authors, that doesn't mean I don't believe in the divine author of the Bible. It's just that if you ask me, how does the divine authorship or the inspiration of the Bible play itself out? My answer is primarily by providential control of all the upbringing, conception, birth, circumstances, conversations that shape the biblical authors. Paul's born into a Jewish family, the tribe of Benjamin. He's raised as a Pharisee. He studies under Gamaliel. And all of this helps shape him into who he is. And then, he gets struck blind on the Damascus Road and he has to reconfigure his entire Jewish worldview around the evident data point that Jesus actually is alive and is the Messiah. But that's, biblical inspiration isn't like, the Cumaean Sibyl in Virgil's Aeneid. where a power takes possession of her. It's like something out of The Exorcist. And she speaks with a totally different voice, and her eyes roll back in her head, and she's foaming at the mouth, and her hair comes undone. No, the spirits of the biblical prophets are subject to the prophets. So I don't think there shouldn't be any conflict. These things were not done in a corner. Christianity, almost uniquely among the great religions of the world, makes historical claims. And we have a corrupt Roman procurator of Judea gets mentioned in the mouths of every Christian weekly when we confess the Nicene Creed. Why? Because we're saying things happened in the first century. And Jesus died on a Roman cross and rose again and was seen by witnesses. It's not about the Buddha sitting under a tree having an enlightenment. It's not Mormonism with its lost text of the Book of Mormon that was just a bolt out of the blue, and now can't, it just didn't leave any traces on history. Ours is a historical faith, and God works in and through history, and there's no conflict between that and inspiration.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, my thoughts are going in a lot of different directions. It's a I think a very worthy endeavor to try to for the church to try to keep in unity the philologist and exegetical brothers and the systematic theologians, and that tension is present, but it's also, I think, mutually reinforcing if done well. I think about Augustine. You brought up Augustine, and On Christian Doctrine, he talks about how, first and foremost, in order to rightly interpret Scripture, you need to know the languages. And he spends a lot of time on that because he says all of Scripture can basically be boiled down to signs and things, what the signs signify. And how can you understand what the signs signify if you don't understand the signs? And even though he himself was limited in his knowledge of the languages, he emphasized that the better you know the languages, the better you'll be able to unravel the mysteries of Scripture. But then he also has those passages in On Christian Doctrine where he talks about what the Greeks have given to us, and what pagan learning and philosophy has given to us. And that's when he uses the classic example of the Israelites. They plundered the Egyptians. They took their gold and silver because it was really God's gold and silver, and they used it to build the tabernacle. And how we take from, he mentioned specifically the Platonists. We take from the Platonists and other philosophers the gold and silver that's rightfully the Lord's. And I think he views some of what Greek philosophy offers as a kind of historical outworking of the Spirit in the Gentiles that kind of prepares the way for them to receive the gospel, and then offers to the church kind of further insights that may not have been present to the Jews when they were reading their own scriptures. And so it seems like in Augustine, for all of his limitations, he kind of is able to hold both of those things together, the emphasis on proper exegesis in the languages, and also kind of making use of the insights of the Greco-Roman world. I'm curious, you don't have to agree with Augustine. He's not Jesus. But do you see in Augustine at all kind of an exemplar maybe of marrying those two, or do you think he, because of his limitations on the linguistic side, for all of his
I was talking with Ansi about this, and I love Augustine. I think he's at his best as sort of doing phenomenology about the letter, examining what actually is going on when his investigation of sex and the body, or his investigation of what holds society together, He's at his best when he's examining things in the world and asking what's behind this reality. So, and of course, hugely influential. We're still reliant on Augustine formulations, whether it's the sign signified, and the application of that to the sacraments, which I'm not necessarily a big fan of, but it's hugely influential, including on the reformers, or just war theory. We're all laboring in the shadow of Augustine. He's at his worst as an exegete. And sometimes he'll say things. It has this discussion in City of God where he's talking about the discrepancies between the Septuagint Greek translation of the Old Testament and the Hebrew text. Things like the age of Methuselah. How old is he? It's a different number in the Greek and in the Hebrew. And Augustine's answers, well, we should just recognize that the Holy Spirit is trying to teach us one thing with the Hebrew and another thing with the Greek, and we should just learn both things. And as a classicist, that is not how it works. The Septuagint is useful. It's a translation. It often attests readings that are correct and that the Masoretic text has lost in the course of the transmission of the Hebrew. But it's not the original. So it is a process. It has to be ongoing because the church needs philosophical theology. I'm by no means saying that we need to just cut that out and throw the baby out with the bathwater. There needs to be a harmony. There needs to be a dance between the exegetes and the philosophical theologians. Sometimes it looks like breakdancing. Sometimes it isn't a beautiful polka or something, but it has to be done. Getting them to talk to each other is valuable. It was a productive debate, I thought, this summer. But I would like to see more of that within Davenant and outside of Davenant, wrestling with what are the limits on each discipline and what can they learn from each other.
That's good. Yeah, what are the limits and what can they learn? Very good. Well, tell us about your courses. So you said you usually teach one course over the summer. Mm-hmm. Do you know what you're going to, tell us what you're teaching now and then what you might teach next year.
Yeah, I'm currently teaching law in the narratives, which is a course in which we're relying largely on David Dauber's scholarship, but also with some insights from some other scholars as well, articles here or there. What we do is Dauber unfolds legal concepts. For instance, if I want to sell a piece of land, it's not the same as selling you a small object, right? Okay, I got some pens. Like, you buy them from me, I can hand them to you, put them in your hand, and you take possession of them. And that's how ownership gets transferred. But that's not how it works with land. And of course, in our society, we've got various methods of conveyance of land. And it's very involved. Right? There are legal contracts, there are realtors involved, there's title company and title insurance. And so how does it work in the Old Testament? And the answer is there's a process called fines demonstrare, pointing out the boundaries, where you take somebody to a place from which they can inspect the land that you're conveying to them. And the main way that happens in the Bible is people get taken up onto mountains and shown the land. Moses, for instance, before his death, he's not allowed to enter, but he is. I mean, it's not just, get a load of what you're not going to enjoy. It's also actually a legal form for conveyance. Moses is symbolically given possession, even though he doesn't get to enter in. Of course, Satan in the New Testament is going to take Jesus up on a mountain and offer him all the kingdoms of the world, because it's a use of this legal form. So we do a lot of this sort of thing. We're looking to find legal forms and see how they're at work. In our opening week, we talked about another legal form. It's called vestigii manatio, the hounding of a person's footsteps. When someone comes and visits your house, and then they say goodbye and drive away, and you discover that the silverware is missing, it's not in the drawer now, you can chase them down and say, "Where's my silverware?" and compel them to let you rummage through their car or their camel caravan. And if you find it, boom, they're guilty, and they have to make restitution and so forth. This principle is at work in a couple of different narratives in the Old Testament. For instance, Joseph and his brothers, when Joseph plants that silver cup and in the bag of Benjamin, and then sends his brothers off, and then sends officers to come find that silver cup, the cup with which I practice divination. Did you not know that such a man as I can certainly divine? The narrative is very humorous about such superstitious practices. The other main story that uses the same legal principle is when Jacob leaves the employ of Laban and takes his wives, Rachel and Leah, and their children with him. And Laban tracks them down and rebukes them and says, "Why did you steal my gods?" And Jacob takes an oath in accordance with this legal form: "With whomever you find your gods, let him not live." And of course, Laban doesn't find his gods. He looks around, and then there's the very insulting and comical scene with Rachel sitting on the saddlebag, and begging her father to excuse her because the manner of women is upon me. I can't rise. I'm busy menstruating on your thighs. So that's what we do in that class. I think it transforms and stimulates people's reading of these passages when they realize, oh, there's some legal background that changes how we understand the motives of the characters and what are their actions really significant. What are they signifying? So we did contract law, levirate marriage, and kinsman redeemer law in the stories of Tamar and Ruth. Next week, we're talking about Jewish relations with Gentiles and Samaritans. So there are laws at work in the book of Esther. We'll be reading the book of Esther closely. And then also laws of cleanness and uncleanness regarding Samaritans. And it was shortly after the New Testament that the Jews passed a law declaring that the Sanhedrin declared that every Samaritan is unclean with the uncleanness of menstruation. So none of them can ever be admitted into any holy space or entrusted with any holy thing. So that's going to shape our reading of Jesus as the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. That's what that course is about. Kind of reread biblical stories with law in mind. So next summer, I'll be going back and probably reteaching a course I taught 3 years ago. It'll be 4 years next summer. Jewish background of the New Testament, first taught in 2020. It was a very well-received class first time around. I know Reese Leverty told me that he attended, I think it was a scholarly talk by a rabbi, Jewish rabbi, and came up and asked questions later. The rabbi was very impressed with how much he knew about Judaism because he had taken my class. Basically, the goal of the class is to equip students to do research on the Jewish background. We dip into all the major sources, a little bit of reading from the Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran, from Philo, from Josephus, and then the major rabbinic sources, the Mishnah, Babylonian Talmud, Sefta, Jerusalem Talmud, just to show students how do we use these? What's the contents of each work? How are they laid out? What kind of issues are in them? How do you navigate the Talmud, for instance? It's massive, encyclopedia-sized collection on different topics. Kiddushin on marriage, and Gittin on divorce, Koholot, rules about cleanness, rules about sacrifice, rules about priesthood, holy days. So yeah, we show students, I should say, how to navigate the Talmud. We also, in that course, acquaint everybody with the major secondary scholarship resources. So Strack Billerbeck, which just got translated into English the last 5 years. It's a masterful compendium of rabbinic parallels to the New Testament that was first assembled in the 1920s in Germany. It hasn't been in English until, I think they started in 2018 or something. David Instone Brewer, who has a series of resources, traditions of the rabbis from the era of the New Testament. It's kind of a flipped commentary. Instead of going through the New Testament like Billerbeck does and finding rabbinic passages that are parallel, he goes to the rabbinic sources, especially the Mishnah, and adduces passages where the Mishnah applies in the New Testament. So flipped it around. David Chilton's series of comparative handbooks on the Gospels. And we talk about the history of scholarship on the Jewish background. We get into some of the Christian Hebraists, in the Netherlands especially, and their theories. And just above all, the course shows how the languages of the Jews, Aramaic and Hebrew, have shaped idioms and phrases in the New Testament. And we just see what difference this makes for our readings and interpretations of New Testament passages. So that's next summer.
Well, that sounds like a course that nobody wants to miss.
You're muted.
Oh,
I think. There you
can
go.
you hear me now? Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a course nobody wants to miss. Well, tell us about upcoming publications that we can be on the lookout for.
So in 2019, I finished my book and published it on the origins of the Eucharist, which kind of brings this Jewish background that we've been talking about, this philology that we've been talking about, brings it to bear on the question of what did Jesus intend and mean when he instituted the Lord's Supper at the Last Supper, and the book argues that it was a Passover meal, and how Passover works and how the Jews thought about Passover should shape our assumptions about how the Eucharist works ever since. So kind of with that same methodology from that earlier book, I'm now bringing it to bear on a different question, which is the origins of ordination as a ritual in the church. What are the offices that the church has? Where did it get those offices? So we're looking at the background in Greco-Roman associations and in households, house church background, but also especially the Jewish institution of the Shaliach, which is a method of representation. The laying on of hands, what does it do? It's a Jewish ritual for making a representative. And then rereading New Testament texts in light of all this background. The pastoral epistles, I taught a course on them last summer, I guess it was. Are Timothy and Titus bishops? Are they pastors? Are they appointing pastors? Are they apostles? So we get into what's the status of Paul and his assistants. I argue that they are apostles of the apostle, sort of second order apostles. And then a large portion of the book, probably more than half of it, is devoted to the question of women's ordination. because we're living in an egalitarian age, and I can't even keep up. Since I started writing this book, there's just this flood of feminist scholarship that continues to need to be taken account of. Rereading all the biblical stories about women, often with an ideological axe to grind, attempting to find warrant for women in the pastorate today, often by sort of a fortiori arguments. So, for instance, Junia is epistemos antos apostolos. She's preeminent among the apostles, along with Andronicus, her presumed husband. So women can be apostles, therefore women can be bishops, therefore women can be priests, therefore women can be deacons. Sort of a fortiori argument. It's not a good argument. Unfortunately for me, and I've talked to you about how much I love languages and historical background. This topic has thrust me into researching some of the things that Joe Minnick does his scholarship on, modernity, and how has modernity changed the debate over women's ordination. Because very much it's not a matter of new arguments. The arguments for women's ordinations are as old as the ancient Montanists. Epiphanius of Salamis discusses what's their main argument for women church officers. Well, it's Galatians 3:28. Right? In Christ there is no male and female, slave no free, Jew no Greek. But you're all one in Christ Jesus. Well, that's not a new argument, and the church has dealt with that long since. So what has changed? The argument hasn't changed. The circumstances and the plausibility structures, as Alistair puts it, have changed. And so we have to get into that in the book. So the working title is Like the Man Himself, is the title for the book. And still looking for publishers right now. Might go with Davenant, might go with Theopolis. I know Peter Lighthurst has expressed some interest. But trying to wrap that up this summer.
Oh, well, we'll be on the lookout for that. That sounds like a must read. Just tell us, as we're kind of wrapping this to a close, maybe tell our viewers what do you think about Davenant Hall as a degree program? Why should people consider taking the MLit or a certificate at Davenant Hall?
Well, I really think that the caliber of the students that I've encountered here in my courses has been just top notch. The discussion has been excellent. There's very much an iron sharpening iron dynamic in Davenant courses. And I think that I've never been in a place where people bring more and sort of pool their knowledge and bring resources together. It's just a tremendous resource as an intellectual community. If you want to know about something, you ask a question on the Davenant Discord or in one of your classes, and you'll find what you're hoping to find. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the other instructors. And I sort of eagerly anticipate when they publish new books. And I listen to their podcasts, Joe Minnick and Alistair Roberts. And I just think it's a top-notch program. I've counted a privilege to be part of it. So the fact that it's also online, I think, is a major advantage. And I think Davenant is doing a good job of leveraging that, using Discord, using its various media outlets, whether it's Ad Fontes or it's the Fellows Lectures online. And I confess that I'm a little envious of those of you in the continental U.S. have a little easier access to Convivia and to Davenant House. But I'm hoping to get there at some point.
Well, we would love to have you. Well, thank you. That was the Reverend Dr. Matt Colvin, lecturer in Bible